August 17th, 1943, 27,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Major Gerd Barkhorn rolled his Messerschmitt Bf-109G6 into position 2,000 yards behind a formation of American B-17 flying fortresses. The bombers flew in what seemed to him an absurdly tight formation, wingtips separated by mere feet, stacked in precise geometric layers. For 2 years, Luftwaffe intelligence had analyzed these formations and concluded they represented American tactical rigidity, an inability to maneuver that would make the bombers easy prey for aggressive fighter attacks. Barkhorn had personally shot down 115 Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front, using tactics refined through 3 years of combat. These American bombers, locked in their inflexible formations, seemed like targets at a shooting gallery. He pushed his throttle forward and dove toward the formation's trailing edge, planning to attack from astern, where his 20mm cannon and machine guns would converge on a single bomber. At 800 yards, the first tracers appeared. Not from the bomber he'd targeted, but from 3 others whose gunners had clear fields of fire intersecting his approach path. At 600 yards, the tracers became a visible stream. At 400 yards, cannon shells from multiple bombers converged on his flight path. Barkhorn broke hard right, pulling 6 Gs as 50 caliber rounds passed through the space his aircraft had occupied a half-second earlier. He cleared the formation without firing a shot, his Bf-109 vibrating from the violent maneuver, his vision tunneling from the G-forces. Behind him, 2 more Luftwaffe fighters broke off their attacks, one trailing smoke from engine damage, the other simply fleeing the converging defensive fire that seemed to fill the entire sky. What Barkhorn didn't yet understand was that he'd just encountered something unprecedented in air warfare history. The combat box formation the Americans flew wasn't a sign of tactical rigidity. It was a carefully engineered system that transformed individual bombers into a unified defensive organism, where every gun aboard every aircraft could engage attackers threatening any aircraft in the formation. The mathematics of mutual defensive fire were being written not in theoretical manuals, but in the blood of Luftwaffe pilots who discovered that attacking what looked like easy targets resulted in casualty rates exceeding anything they'd experienced on the Eastern Front. The Germans had dismissed American formation flying as evidence of poor training and lack of combat flexibility. They were about to learn that the rigid formations they mocked created interlocking fields of fire that made bomber interception suicidally expensive. The story of how geometric precision transformed vulnerable bombers into defensive fortresses begins not with combat, but with cold mathematical analysis of defensive firepower performed by American tacticians who understood that survival depended on geometry as much as courage. The concept emerged from brutal experience gained over European skies through 1942 and early 1943, when American bombers flying in loose formations suffered catastrophic losses to German fighter attacks. The problem was fundamental. A B-17 flying fortress carried 13 50 caliber machine guns, 2 in the nose, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret beneath the fuselage, 2 in the waist positions, 2 in the tail, 1 in the radio operator's position, and 2 in cheek mounts added to later models. This armament represented the heaviest defensive battery ever installed in a bomber. But each gun had limited traverse and coverage. The tail guns covered the rear hemisphere. The ball turret covered below. The top turret covered above and to the sides. Waist guns covered the beam positions. Every gun position had blind spots, sectors where the guns couldn't train due to fuselage structure, wings, or tail surfaces blocking the line of fire. A lone B-17, attacked by fighters, had large vulnerable zones. German pilots quickly learned to approach from 12 o'clock level, directly ahead, where only the 2 nose guns could engage, or they attacked from 6 o'clock high, diving from above and behind, where only the tail guns could fire back, and the extreme angle made accurate defensive fire nearly impossible. Or they pressed attacks from 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock level, approaching from the beam where waist gunners had to track fast-moving targets crossing their field of view, at high angular velocity. The RAF had faced similar problems with their heavy bombers and concluded that night bombing was the only viable solution. Flying at night prevented German fighters from executing precise visual attacks. But night bombing sacrificed accuracy. The Norden bomb sight, America's precision bombing instrument, required visual target acquisition. Strategic bombing doctrine, as developed by the Air Corps Tactical School during the 1930s, emphasized daylight precision attacks against specific industrial targets: ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries, rail yards. Night area bombing of cities might destroy German morale, but it wouldn't systematically dismantle German industrial capacity. The Americans were committed to daylight precision bombing, despite RAF warnings that it would result in unsustainable losses. The solution required making formations of individual aircraft function as integrated defensive systems. This concept wasn't entirely new. Naval tactics had long recognized that ships in formation could support each other with coordinated fire. But extending this principle to aircraft flying in three-dimensional space at 200 mph created geometric problems that required new solutions. The work began at the Beta Bomber Command headquarters in England under Brigadier General Ira Eaker in early 1943. Eaker assigned his operations staff to analyze combat losses and develop formation patterns that would maximize defensive firepower while maintaining bombing accuracy. Major Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bomb Group, became the primary architect of what would become the combat box formation. LeMay was 36 years old in 1943, a career officer who had joined the Army Air Corps in 1928 and spent 15 years mastering navigation, bombing techniques, and tactical doctrine. He was known for analytical thinking and relentless focus on combat effectiveness. He studied after-action reports from every mission, analyzed gun camera footage, interviewed surviving crews, and examined damaged aircraft to understand exactly how German fighters were attacking and where American defenses were failing. The analysis revealed clear patterns. German fighters avoided head-on attacks early in the war, but increasingly used them as American tail defenses improved. The Bf-109 and FW-190 fighters could close from 1,000 yards to firing range in approximately 12 seconds when approaching head-on at combined closing speeds exceeding 500 mph. This gave defensive gunners minimal time to engage. German pilots would open fire at 800 to 1,000 yards, spraying cannon shells and machine gun rounds in the general direction of the formation, then break away at the last moment. Even without precise aim, the sheer volume of fire at short range often damaged bombers or killed crew members. Attacks from astern 6 o'clock level or 6 o'clock high allowed German fighters to pace the bombers, tracking them for extended firing passes. The B-17's tail guns provided the only defense, and two guns couldn't generate sufficient suppressive fire to deter aggressive attackers. German pilots learned to approach from slightly below the bomber's altitude, pulling up to firing position, where the tail gunner had to track an accelerating target at an awkward upward angle while experiencing slipstream buffeting. Beam attacks from 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock offered German fighters brief windows of vulnerability as they crossed through the formation's altitude band. But the crossing speed was so high that defensive gunners had only seconds to track, aim, and fire. Most defensive fire missed completely. The few hits scored rarely damaged fighters enough to prevent them from breaking away and repositioning for another attack. LeMay's solution was elegant in concept but extraordinarily demanding in execution. Instead of aircraft flying in loose formations with 100 to 200 yard separation, B-17s would fly in tight formations with wingtips separated by less than 10 feet vertically and horizontally. Multiple three-aircraft Vs would stack in precise geometric relationships, creating boxes of 18 to 21 aircraft flying as a single unit. These boxes would be positioned relative to other boxes, so that the defensive guns from every aircraft could cover the blind spots of every other aircraft. The mathematics were complex, but the principle was simple. If a German fighter attacked any bomber in the formation, multiple bombers could bring their guns to bear on the attacking fighter. An attack from dead astern didn't face just two tail guns from the target bomber, but also top turret guns from bombers ahead of and below the target, ball turret guns from bombers ahead and above, and waist guns from bombers in adjacent positions. An attack from the beam faced waist guns from multiple bombers, top turrets from aircraft in the opposite element, and ball turrets from aircraft above or below. A head-on attack faced the nose guns of the target bomber, plus top turret and ball turret fire from aircraft in the formation's rear elements, all converging on the fighter's flight path. The concept was sound, but implementing it required airmanship and training far exceeding normal standards. Flying a 4-engine bomber weighing 65,000 pounds at 200 mph in formation, with wingtips 10 feet apart, required constant attention and precise control inputs. The bomber flight characteristics were unforgiving. The B-17 had heavy control forces, sluggish response to pitch and roll inputs, and significant trim changes with power settings. Maintaining precise position relative to the lead aircraft while that aircraft maneuvered through turns, climbed to altitude, and dealt with weather-required skills that took months to develop. Pilots had to anticipate the lead aircraft's movements and adjust power and control inputs constantly. Too much throttle, and you'd overtake the lead, forcing violent corrections. Too little, and you'd fall behind, opening gaps that broke the formation's defensive integrity. Changes in altitude required constant trim adjustments as air density varied. Weather conditions, turbulence, icing, wind shear, complicated everything. Flying in clouds or above undercast where visual references disappeared demanded instrument flying while maintaining formation, a combination that pushed pilot workload to maximum. The European weather made formation flying brutally difficult. Clouds from ground level to 20,000 feet were common. Bombers would take off individually, climb through overcast lasting tens of thousands of feet, and form up above the weather using radio beacons and timing marks. Assembly areas over England became crowded with dozens of bomb groups, each trying to form their aircraft into proper formations before heading to targets in Germany. Mid-air collisions during assembly killed crews with depressing regularity. Poor visibility, radio interference, navigation errors, and mechanical problems combined to create chaos over English airfields every mission morning. But LeMay insisted the tight formations were non-negotiable. He took personal control of the 305th Bomb Group's training, flying as lead pilot on early missions to demonstrate that the formations could be flown in combat. He fired pilots who couldn't maintain formation. He developed detailed briefing procedures that specified exact positions for every aircraft, timing marks for assembly, navigation checkpoints, and bombing procedures. He practiced formation, flying constantly, taking his group up for training missions between combat operations until crews could fly the combat box in their sleep. The first test came on May 17, 1943, when LeMay led the 305th Bomb Group on a mission to attack the Luftwaffe depot at Lorient, France. His group flew in a tight combat box with 18 aircraft in precise geometric positions. German fighters attacked aggressively, as they had against previous American formations. But the defensive fire from LeMay's formation proved devastating. Multiple aircraft engaged each attacking fighter. The converging fire created a visible cone of tracers. German fighters that pressed their attacks through this fire took hits from multiple guns simultaneously. The 305th lost no aircraft to fighters that day. Several German fighters were seen going down, trailing smoke. Bait! Bomber Command Headquarters analyzed the mission results and ordered immediate adoption of the combat box formation across all bomb groups. LeMay was promoted and transferred to the 4th Bomb Wing to implement his formations on a larger scale. Through June and July 1943, American bomb groups trained intensively in the new formations. The transition was painful. Mid-air collisions increased as pilots unused to tight formation flying made fatal errors. Some groups resisted, arguing that the formations were too demanding and that more flexible tactics would prove superior in combat. But the mission results spoke clearly. Groups flying tight combat boxes suffered lower loss rates than groups flying loose formations. The defensive firepower statistics were undeniable. A combat box of 18 bombers could bring 30 to 40 guns to bear on any attacking fighter, depending on attack angle. This created a defensive zone approximately 1,000 yards deep and 400 yards wide, where any fighter faced fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. German pilots learned quickly that penetrating this zone meant absorbing hits. Breaking through the zone to reach individual bombers often meant taking so much damage that the fighter couldn't continue attacking or couldn't make it home. The Luftwaffe response evolved through summer 1943 as German fighter pilots adapted their tactics to the increasingly deadly American formations. The changes revealed in captured documents and post-war interviews show a force struggling to counter a defensive system that transformed every advantage German fighters possessed into liabilities. German fighter tactics through 1942 and early 1943 had emphasized individual initiative and flexible attacks. Pilots would stalk bomber formations, identify stragglers or damaged aircraft, and attack individually or in small groups. This worked well against RAF bombers flying at night, where isolated aircraft were common, and against early American formations that were loose enough that individual bombers could be separated and destroyed. The combat box eliminated stragglers through sheer social pressure and operational necessity. Pilots who fell behind or maneuvered away from the formation found themselves alone and vulnerable. The standing order in every bomb group was absolute: maintain formation at all costs. Damaged aircraft struggling to keep up would be abandoned by the formation if they fell too far behind, but crews would do everything possible to stay with the group because survival depended on the formation's defensive firepower. This meant aircraft with one or even two engines knocked out, with severe battle damage, with wounded crew members, would maintain formation until they physically couldn't fly anymore. German pilots quickly learned that trying to separate bombers from the formation rarely worked. The Americans would maintain formation integrity even when under heavy attack. Fighters would attack from multiple angles simultaneously, and the bombers would simply absorb the damage while their defensive gunners kept firing. The discipline was remarkable and frustrating for German pilots accustomed to opponents who would break formation when pressed hard. The Luftwaffe's response was to mass fighters for concentrated attacks. Instead of small groups of 2 to 4 fighters attacking, entire staffel of 12 to 16 aircraft would attack a single combat box simultaneously. The theory was that massed attacks would overwhelm defensive fire through sheer numbers. If 10 fighters attacked from astern simultaneously, the bombers couldn't engage all of them effectively. Some fighters would absorb defensive fire, but others would get through and inflict crippling damage. This tactic worked occasionally, but had severe limitations. Assembling large fighter formations required time and coordination. German fighters would form up ahead of the bomber stream, sometimes 50 to 100 miles ahead of the approaching Americans. They'd climb to altitude above the bombers, then execute mass attacks diving through the formations. But this required precise timing and navigation. If the bomber stream deviated from the expected course, or if timing was wrong, the fighter formations would miss the bombers entirely. The massed attacks also meant German fighters often got in each other's way. With 10 or 15 fighters trying to press attacks simultaneously from similar angles, collision risks increased dramatically. Pilots had to focus on not hitting their own comrades as much as on hitting the bombers. The defensive fire from the bombers, while perhaps not able to track every attacking fighter individually, created zones of intense fire density. Fighters attacking in formation had to fly through these zones, and the longer they remained in the zone, the more likely they were to take hits. The head-on attack emerged as the Luftwaffe's preferred tactic by mid-1943. Approaching the bomber formation from 12 o'clock level or 12 o'clock high gave fighters the combined closing speed advantage and limited the bomber's defensive response to nose guns alone. The early B-17F models had only two 50 caliber guns in the nose operated by the bombardier and navigator, neither of whom were trained gunners. The G model introduced in September 1943 added a chin turret with two additional guns, but this was a response to the head-on attacks rather than a deterrent already in place. Luftwaffe pilots would form up ahead of the bomber stream, climbing to an altitude 2,000 to 3,000 feet above the Americans. They'd turn to face the oncoming bombers, then dive slightly to build speed, before pulling up into a head-on pass. The attack would begin at ranges of 1,200 to 1,000 yards, well beyond effective defensive fire range. German fighters mounted 20mm and 30mm cannon plus machine guns, giving them reach advantages over the American 50 caliber machine guns. They'd open fire early, spraying shells into the formation more than aiming precisely at individual bombers. At combined closing speeds exceeding 500 mm, the engagement lasted only seconds. At 1,000 yards, the fighter would begin firing. At 500 yards, both sides would be firing with reasonable accuracy. At 200 yards, collision became a serious risk. German pilots were trained to break away at 100 to 200 yards, rolling inverted and pulling through to dive beneath the bombers, or braking hard left or right to pass outside the formation. American bomber pilots reported fighters passing so close that they could see German pilots' faces. Some B-17s returned with damage from German aircraft that clipped their wingtips or tails during attack breakaways. The head-on attack was terrifying for bomber crews. Watching fighters approach at closing speeds where the range decreased 500 feet per second meant that fighters that appeared as distant specks one moment would be firing cannon shells the next moment. The psychological impact of having enemy fighters diving directly toward you, their wings sparkling with muzzle flashes, was severe. Some pilots and co-pilots instinctively ducked or flinched. Some broke formation, turning away from the attacking fighters, which immediately exposed them to follow-on attacks. But the combat box formation mitigated even head-on attacks through geometric principles LeMay and his staff had calculated precisely. While only the nose guns of the lead element could fire forward, the top turrets and ball turrets of aircraft in trail positions could fire past the lead aircraft at approaching fighters. The staggered vertical positioning of the combat box meant that second and third elements flew 150 to 200 feet below and behind the lead element. Their turret guns could elevate to engage fighters attacking the lead element without hitting their own aircraft. A fighter making a head-on attack on the combat box's lead aircraft would face two nose guns from the target bomber, but also top turret fire from 2 or 3 bombers in trail positions, and possibly ball turret fire from bombers below and behind if the fighter's attack angle brought it through their field of fire. This meant that instead of facing 2 guns, the fighter faced 8 to 12 guns concentrated on its flight path. The defensive fire density transformed head-on attacks from relatively safe tactics into missions with casualty rates that shocked Luftwaffe commanders. At ranges of 800 to 500 yards, where fighters had to commit to their attack runs, multiple bomber gunners would open fire simultaneously. The combined fire from 8 to 12 guns created probability zones where hits became likely rather than possible. Fighters had to fly through these zones to press their attacks. The faster they approached, the less time they spent in the zone, but also the less time they had to aim accurately. The mathematics of defensive fire worked in the bomber's favor. A 50 caliber machine gun fired approximately 800 rounds per minute, or 13 rounds per second. 10 guns firing simultaneously put 130 rounds per second into the air. Over a 3-second engagement, that meant 390 rounds fired. If those rounds converged in a cone covering the fighter's approach path, the probability of the fighter absorbing multiple hits approached certainty. German fighters were not designed to absorb battle damage. The Bf-109G6 that Barkhorn flew had no armor protection for the engine. A single 50 caliber round through the cooling system would cause the engine to overheat and fail within minutes. The fuel tanks, while self-sealing, could be overwhelmed by multiple hits. The cockpit had minimal armor, and the canopy glass offered no protection against 50 caliber rounds. Hits to the wings damaged control surfaces or destroyed hydraulic systems. Hits to the fuselage often damaged radios, oxygen systems, or control cables. The cumulative effect was that German fighters pressing attacks through defensive fire zones frequently took damage that forced them to break off, return to base, or simply crash. Pilots who survived these attacks reported being hit by multiple rounds during single attack passes. Aircraft would return with dozens of holes in wings, fuselage, and tail. Engine damage was common. Some pilots made it back to base, only to find their aircraft too damaged for repair. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe fighter pilots was severe and cumulative. Pilots who had experienced success against Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front, where air combat occurred at lower altitudes with less organized defensive fire, found the American bombers' defensive systems shockingly effective. The massed defensive fire created visual and psychological effects beyond the physical damage. Tracers converging from multiple bombers created visible cones of fire that were intimidating even to experienced pilots. The smoke, the noise, the sheer volume of fire made pressing attacks an act of sustained courage. Pilots began reporting in after-action debriefs that attacking the American formations felt suicidal. The casualty statistics supported this perception. Luftwaffe fighter losses to defensive bomber. Fire increased dramatically through late 1943. While precise statistics varied by mission and sector, German fighter units attacking American bomber formations typically lost 5% to 15% of attacking aircraft per mission. These loss rates were unsustainable. The mission to Schweinfurt on August 17, 1943, demonstrated both the effectiveness of the combat box formation and its limitations when fighter escort wasn't available. The target was ball-bearing factories that produced critical components for German war industry. The mission required deep penetration into Germany, beyond the range of escort fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolt escorts could accompany the bombers only to the German border, before fuel constraints forced them to turn back. The 8th Air Force dispatched 230 B-17s on the Schweinfurt mission, organized into combat box formations. German controllers, tracking the inbound raid, assembled approximately 300 fighters to intercept. The attacks began as soon as American escorts turned back. For the next hour and a half, German fighters pressed attacks continuously. Individual bombers faced 5, 10, sometimes 15 separate fighter attacks during the mission. The combat boxes maintained formation integrity despite catastrophic damage. Aircraft with engines knocked out continued flying in formation. Bombers with dead crew members, with holes blown in wings and fuselage, with control surface damage that made flight difficult, stayed in formation because that was the only hope of survival. The defensive firepower from the formations destroyed or damaged dozens of German fighters, but the continuous attacks overwhelmed some boxes. When aircraft fell behind or maneuvered away from formation, German fighters swarmed them and finished them off. The 8th Air Force lost 36 bombers on the mission, a 15% loss rate. Another 122 aircraft returned with battle damage, many so severely damaged they required weeks of repair. The human cost was staggering, 360 crew members killed or captured, but the German losses were equally severe. Luftwaffe fighter units engaged in the Schweinfurt mission lost approximately 38 aircraft destroyed and another 20 damaged. The exchange ratio was nearly 1-to-1, far worse than German commanders expected, given that their fighters had attacked unescorted bombers. The combat box formation had proven its value even under the worst circumstances. The loss rate, while painful, would have been catastrophically higher with loose formations. Post-mission analysis estimated that without the tight defensive formations, losses might have exceeded 30%, a rate that would have ended daylight bombing permanently. The German fighters had paid a price in aircraft and pilots that they couldn't afford. Unlike the Americans, who could replace losses through vast training pipelines and industrial production, German fighter forces were already stretched thin, defending against raids from both American and British forces. The analysis of camera footage from both sides revealed the tactical dynamics with brutal clarity. German pilots consistently reported that they'd scored hits on bombers, seen wings or engines damaged, observed bombers falling behind formations. What they didn't realize was how much damage B-17s could absorb while remaining flyable. The Boeing engineers had designed structural redundancy into the aircraft. Wings could lose large sections and still generate lift. Two engines could be knocked out, and the aircraft could maintain formation on the remaining two. Hydraulic systems had backup modes. Control surfaces could be damaged, and pilots could compensate with rudder and throttle inputs. American gun camera footage showed the defensive fire density that German pilots faced. Multiple tracers converging on single fighters, attack runs broken off as pilots maneuvered desperately to escape fire zones, fighters trailing smoke or pieces after taking hits. The footage documented what American gunners had reported. The formation's defensive fire was devastatingly effective when aircraft maintained tight geometric positions. The development of the combat box continued through late 1943 and into 1944 as American tacticians refined the concept. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang escort fighter with range to accompany bombers deep into Germany transformed the equation completely. Now combat boxes flew with fighter escort that could engage German interceptors before they reached the bombers. The combination of long-range escorts and tight defensive formations made bomber losses manageable and German fighter losses unsustainable. LeMay's promotion to command the 3rd Air Division put him in position to implement combat box tactics across multiple bomb wings. His formations became increasingly sophisticated. The basic unit remained the 18 to 21 aircraft combat box, but multiple boxes were stacked vertically and horizontally to create division formations of 54 to 72 aircraft. These massive formations presented German fighters with target arrays, where attacking any bomber meant exposure to fire from dozens of guns. The vertical stacking was particularly important. Lead boxes flew at the mission's assigned altitude, typically 25,000 to 27,000 feet. High boxes flew 500 to 1,000 feet above the lead. Low boxes flew 500 to 1,000 feet below the lead. This vertical dispersion meant that fighters attacking any box would be exposed to fire from boxes above or below. The geometric relationship created interlocking fire zones through the entire formation's altitude band. German intelligence officers studying the American formations recognized them as formidable defensive systems. Captured documents from Luftwaffe fighter commands in late 1943 show commanders warning pilots about the massed defensive fire. Tactical directives emphasized attacking damaged stragglers rather than pressing attacks against intact formations. Some commanders recommended avoiding combat with American bombers, entirely when possible, focusing instead on forcing them to jettison bombs early or disrupting their formations through threat displays rather than pressed attacks. But avoiding combat wasn't strategically viable. The American bombers were systematically destroying German industrial capacity. Factories had to be defended. This meant German fighters had to attack despite the casualties. The Luftwaffe trapped itself in an attrition battle where each mission inflicted losses the Germans couldn't replace, while American losses, though painful, were sustainable given American training and production capacity. The training requirements for combat box flying created challenges for American replacement crews. New pilots arriving in England in late 1943 found themselves assigned to bomb groups flying missions deep into Germany with minimal formation training. The transition from stateside training to combat operations was abrupt and deadly. Pilots who couldn't maintain formation position endangered themselves and everyone around them. Gaps in formations created vulnerabilities that German fighters exploited. Aircraft that wandered out of position became targets. The solution was intensive formation training conducted between combat missions. Bomb groups would fly local training missions, practicing assembly procedures, formation flying at altitude, and coordinated turns. New pilots flew with experienced instructors in the right seat, learning the feel of formation flying under supervision before being trusted to fly combat missions. The training was exhausting and demanding, but it was non-negotiable. Formation integrity was survival. The physical demands of formation flying on long missions were severe. A typical mission to targets in central Germany required 8 to 10 hours of flight time. Pilots spent the entire mission making constant throttle and control inputs to maintain position. The workload was unrelenting. There were no breaks, no opportunities to relax. Co-pilots could assist, but the pilot aircraft commander was ultimately responsible for position. Fatigue accumulated over hours, hands cramped from constant control inputs, shoulders ached from control forces, eyes strained from staring at the lead aircraft's position relative to reference marks. The physical stress, combined with oxygen deprivation at high altitude, cold temperatures despite heated suits, and the constant threat of attack created conditions that pushed crews to their limits. Pilots reported hallucinations on long missions, seeing things that weren't there, experiencing time distortion where hours seemed like minutes or minutes like hours. The formation discipline kept them focused. The knowledge that survival depended on maintaining position overrode fatigue and fear. The effectiveness of the combat box formation can be measured in multiple ways, but the most direct measurement is the exchange ratio between bombers lost and fighters destroyed. In early 1943, before combat boxes became standard, the exchange ratio favored German fighters approximately 2.1. For every German fighter lost, 2 American bombers went down. This ratio was unsustainable for the bomber offensive. By late 1943, after combat boxes became universal, the exchange ratio had shifted to approximately 1.1. German fighters and American bombers were being lost at similar rates. This parity was strategically favorable to the Americans because they could replace losses, while Germans increasingly couldn't. By early 1944, with the addition of long-range fighter escorts, the ratio shifted further. German fighters were being lost at rates exceeding bomber losses. The cumulative effect destroyed the Luftwaffe's fighter force. Through 1943 and early 1944, German fighter pilot casualties increased to unsustainable levels. The veterans who had learned their craft in Spain, Poland, and the early Eastern Front campaigns were systematically eliminated. Their replacements, rushed through abbreviated training programs, lacked the experience and skill to survive in combat against American formations defended by escorts. By mid-1944, the situation had become catastrophic for German fighter forces. Missions against American bomber streams resulted in German fighter losses exceeding 10% per sortie. Pilot replacement couldn't keep pace with casualties. The training infrastructure collapsed under Allied bombing. Fuel shortages limited training flight time. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the Luftwaffe could barely contest Allied air superiority. The strategic consequences extended far beyond aerial combat. The ability to conduct daylight precision bombing meant American bombers could systematically destroy specific German industries. Ball bearing plants, aircraft factories, oil refineries, rail yards, all became targets that could be attacked and destroyed with reasonable accuracy. The cumulative damage to German war production was enormous and ultimately decisive. The combat box formation made this strategic bombing campaign possible by reducing bomber losses to manageable levels. Without the geometric precision that created interlocking fields of fire, daylight bombing would have been abandoned, as the RAF had predicted. The tight formations that Luftwaffe intelligence dismissed as rigid American tactical thinking proved to be sophisticated defensive systems that German fighters couldn't overcome. The human cost of developing and implementing combat box tactics deserves recognition, often overshadowed by strategic analysis. The crews who flew these formations faced terror daily. The men who died when formations broke down, when German fighters found gaps, when mechanical failures forced aircraft to fall behind. These men paid the price for tactical lessons learned. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars for life. The gunners who manned the defensive positions deserve particular recognition. Ball turret gunners were essentially trapped in plexiglass spheres beneath the fuselage, operating in sub-zero temperatures with minimal protection. Waist gunners stood at open windows, exposed to slipstream and cold, firing heavy machine guns at targets crossing their field of view at hundreds of miles per hour. Tail gunners sat alone in the aircraft's rear, the last line of defense against the most common attack angle, knowing that if their position took a direct hit, there was no escape. These men maintained their defensive fire, even when wounded, even when oxygen systems failed, even when hydraulic fluid from damaged systems covered them, making every surface slippery and dangerous. They kept their guns firing when common sense said to bail out, because they knew their survival, and everyone else's survival depended on maintaining the formation's defensive integrity. The pilots who held formation through battles that killed crew members and damaged their aircraft demonstrated extraordinary discipline. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the famous Memphis Belle, described holding formation during a mission where his co-pilot was killed by cannon fire. 2 engines were shot out, and the bombardier was seriously wounded. He maintained position because falling behind meant certain death for the remaining crew. Memphis Belle completed its 25-mission tour and returned to the United States for a war bond tour, but Morgan and his crew were not exceptional. Hundreds of crews demonstrated similar courage and skill on missions that never became famous. The ground crews who maintained the aircraft deserve recognition for enabling the tactical success. B-17s returned from missions with hundreds of holes in wings and fuselage, with engines destroyed, with control surfaces damaged. Maintenance crews worked through nights in English winter weather, replacing engines, patching holes, repairing control systems, and restoring aircraft to flyable condition. Their work was unglamorous, but essential. Without them, the combat boxes couldn't have been assembled because there wouldn't have been enough flyable aircraft. The tactical evolution continued through 1944 as the Luftwaffe adapted and Americans counter-adapted. German fighters began using standoff weapons, launching rockets from beyond defensive gun range. The Americans countered with fighter escorts that engaged German fighters before they could launch. The Germans tried using heavily armed and armored FW-190s as bomber destroyers, accepting lower speed and maneuverability in exchange for survivability and firepower. The Americans countered by having escorts specifically target these slower aircraft. The introduction of the B-17G model in late 1943 addressed one of the combat box's few remaining vulnerabilities. The chin turret with 2 additional 50 caliber guns in the nose significantly strengthened forward defense. Now head-on attacks faced 4 nose guns plus turret fire from trail aircraft. The additional firepower made head-on attacks even more costly for German fighters. By early 1944, Luftwaffe pilots reported that all approach angles to American formations were heavily defended. The final phase of the daylight bombing campaign saw combat boxes escorted by overwhelming fighter strength. Missions to Berlin and other distant targets flew with escort fighters outnumbering bombers. German fighters that attempted interception faced American fighters with performance advantages, numerical superiority, and aggressive tactics. The combat boxes continued flying their precise geometric patterns, but increasingly they faced minimal fighter opposition because German fighters were being destroyed by escorts before reaching the bombers. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The combination of cumulative losses, fuel shortages, and the collapse of training infrastructure meant German fighter opposition had become sporadic and ineffective. American bomber formations flew missions over Germany with minimal losses. The combat box formations remained standard because they worked and because discipline had become ingrained. But the desperate battles of 1943 were past. The post-war analysis by military historians and air power theorists recognized the combat box as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the air war. The formations demonstrated that defensive systems, properly engineered, could overcome offensive advantages. German fighters had superiority in speed, climb rate, and armament. But the geometric precision of American formations created defensive fire density that neutralized these advantages. The lessons influenced post-war bomber doctrine for decades. The B-29 superfortresses that bombed Japan flew in loose formations because Japanese fighter opposition proved less intense than German resistance. But the principle of mutual defensive support remained. The B-36 and B-47 bombers of the early Cold War were designed with defensive armament systems that assumed formation flying. Only with the advent of jet bombers capable of supersonic speeds did the concept of formation bombing become obsolete, replaced by individual aircraft relying on speed and altitude for defense. The combat box formation's legacy extends beyond specific tactical applications. It demonstrated principles that remain relevant, that properly organized systems can overcome individual capability advantages, that discipline and precision create force multiplication, that geometry and mathematics apply to combat as much as courage and skill. These lessons transcend technology and era. The men who flew in combat boxes understood instinctively what analysts later confirmed through statistical study. Formation integrity was survival, the geometric precision that required such skill and discipline to maintain created defensive capabilities that transformed individual aircraft into something far more powerful. The whole exceeded the sum of its parts, not through mystical synergy, but through simple mathematics. More guns engaging each attacker, interlocking fields of fire with no gaps, mutual support that prevented individual aircraft from being isolated and destroyed. Major Curtis LeMay, who pioneered the combat box formations, later commanded the strategic bombing campaign against Japan and eventually became Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. His tactical innovations over Europe shaped his understanding of air power and organizational effectiveness. In interviews late in his career, LeMay emphasized that the combat box succeeded not because it was clever, but because it was ruthlessly practical. "We needed to solve a problem," he said in a 1968 interview. German fighters were shooting down too many bombers. The solution was to make sure every attacking fighter faced more guns than he could handle. The tight formations did that. They were hard to fly, they were demanding, but they worked. That's all that mattered. The German perspective on the combat boxes evolved from dismissal to grudging respect to outright fear. Luftwaffe pilot accounts from early 1943 describe American formations as rigid and inflexible, suggesting easy targets. By late 1943, the same pilots describe formations as heavily defended and dangerous. By 1944, surviving German pilots describe American bomber formations as nearly suicidal to attack without overwhelming numerical superiority. Major Heinz Knoke, a Luftwaffe fighter ace who survived the war with 33 victories, wrote in his diary in October 1943 after attacking an American formation. "The defensive fire from these bomber boxes is beyond anything we encountered against the British night bombers. They fly so close together that their guns overlap. Attacking them means flying through a cone of fire where hits are almost inevitable. We lost 3 aircraft today attacking a single box of bombers. We claimed 2 bombers destroyed. This exchange ratio will destroy us if it continues." Knoke's assessment proved prophetic. The Luftwaffe fighter force suffered approximately 2,200 fighter pilot casualties in 1943, including those killed, seriously wounded, or captured. The replacement pipeline produced approximately 1,800 new pilots that year. The deficit grew larger in 1944 as American bombing operations intensified and fighter escort became universal. By the end of 1944, Luftwaffe fighter forces were shells of their former capability, manned largely by inexperienced pilots who had minimal chance of survival against American formations and their escorts. The technical specifications of the combat box formations demonstrated the geometric precision required. A standard lead box consisted of 3 elements: lead, high, and low. The lead element contained 6 aircraft in 2 Vs of 3 aircraft each. The high element flew 1,000 feet above and 1,000 feet behind the lead, also with 6 aircraft. The low element flew 1,000 feet below and 1,000 feet behind the lead, with 6 to 9 aircraft depending on strength available. Within each element, aircraft spacing was precise. Wingtip to wingtip separation was 50 to 75 feet. Vertical separation between VEs was 150 feet. Fore-aft separation between aircraft in the V was calculated so that each aircraft's propeller wash wouldn't affect aircraft behind. This typically meant 150 to 200 feet of trail distance between aircraft in the same V. These precise spacings created overlapping gun coverage zones. The top turret on a B-17 could traverse 360 degrees horizontally and elevate from horizontal to 85 degrees above horizontal. The ball turret could traverse 360 degrees and cover from 90 degrees above horizontal to 0 degrees below horizontal. Tail guns covered from directly astern to approximately 30 degrees off the tail in any direction. Waist guns covered the beam positions with approximately 90 degrees of traverse each. When aircraft were positioned properly, a fighter attacking from any angle would be engaged by multiple gun positions. The calculations showed that an attack from dead astern at level flight would face 2 tail guns from the target bomber, plus 2 top turret guns each from 3 bombers in forward positions, plus 2 ball turret guns each from 2 bombers in high positions. Total, 12 guns. An attack from 12 o'clock level would face 2 nose guns from the target bomber, plus 4 top turret guns from bombers in trail positions, plus 4 ball turret guns from bombers above and behind. Total, 10 guns. An attack from 3 o'clock level would face 2 waist guns from the target bomber, plus 6 to 8 additional waist guns from adjacent bombers, plus 2 to 4 top turret guns from bombers in opposite positions, plus 2 to 4 ball turret guns from bombers above or below. Total, 12 to 18 guns. These numbers assumed perfect formation, integrity, and proper defensive discipline. In practice, formation positions were never perfect. Aircraft wandered slightly. Evasive maneuvering during attacks disrupted spacing temporarily. Gun malfunctions reduced available firepower. But even with degraded conditions, the combat box typically brought 8 to 12 guns to bear on any attacking fighter, creating fire density that made successful attacks extremely costly. The ammunition expenditure during missions was staggering. Each B-17 carried approximately 11,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed across its 13 gun positions. A typical mission to Germany might see bombers expending 70% to 90% of their ammunition during fighter attacks and anti-aircraft evasion. Groups returning from heavily contested missions would have fired over 1.5 million rounds. The spent brass casings ejected from the aircraft during combat fell like metallic rain over the European countryside. The logistics of supporting combat box operations were immense. Each B-17 required approximately 200 man-hours of maintenance between missions. Engines needed regular service. Hydraulic systems required constant attention. Oxygen systems had to be recharged. Armor plate had to be inspected for cracks. Gun systems needed cleaning and function checks. Ammunition had to be loaded, carefully distributed to maintain proper weight and balance. Bomb loads had to be assembled and loaded. Fuel tanks had to be filled, sometimes with different fuel loads for different positions in the formation, since lead aircraft navigated and consumed more fuel than wing aircraft. The ground crews worked in conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to miserable. English weather meant rain, fog, and cold. Maintenance often occurred outdoors on open hardstands. Lighting was minimal for security reasons. Tools were basic. Spare parts were sometimes scarce. Yet the maintenance crews kept the bombers flying. The sortie generation rate, the percentage of assigned aircraft that could be made flyable for each mission, typically exceeded 80%, remarkable given the battle damage and mechanical stress the aircraft endured. The human cost of the bombing campaign remained staggering, despite the combat box's defensive effectiveness. The 8th Air Force suffered approximately 26,000 killed in action and 18,000 wounded during its operations over Europe. An additional 28,000 aircrew became prisoners of war, many after being shot down and surviving the bailout and landing. These casualties represented approximately 40% of the total aircrew assigned to heavy bomber units during the war. The casualty rates varied significantly by time period and mission. Early 1943, before combat boxes became standard, saw loss rates per mission averaging 7% to 10%. After combat boxes were implemented, but before long-range escorts became available, loss rates dropped to 4% to 6% per mission. After the introduction of Mustang escorts in early 1944, loss rates fell to 2% to 3% per mission. These percentages seem small until translated into human terms. A 5% loss rate on a mission with 300 bombers meant 15 aircraft lost, each carrying 10 crew members, totaling 150 men killed, wounded, or captured on a single mission. The psychological impact of sustained combat operations under these conditions created casualties that weren't reflected in killed and wounded statistics. Combat fatigue, what later generations would call post-traumatic stress disorder, affected significant percentages of aircrew. The policy of requiring 25 or later 30 missions before rotation back to the United States meant that aircrew faced repeated exposure to life-threatening situations over extended periods. The mathematical probability of surviving a tour of duty in 1943 before the introduction of fighter escorts was approximately 25%. Aircrew understood these odds. They lived with the knowledge that statistically, most of them wouldn't complete their tours. The coping mechanisms varied. Some crew members became fatalistic, believing their survival was a matter of luck beyond their control. Others became superstitious, developing elaborate rituals that they believed would protect them. Some found solace in religious faith. Others focused on the mission's importance, finding meaning in the strategic bombing campaign's contribution to winning the war. Group cohesion and unit identity provided critical psychological support. Crews that flew together repeatedly developed bonds that transcended normal friendship. The training pipeline that produced combat box aircrews represented one of America's most impressive organizational achievements. At peak operation in 1944, the Army Air Forces trained approximately 100,000 aircrew annually. The training progression began with basic flight training for pilots, aerial gunnery school for gunners, and bombardier or navigator schools for those specialists. After basic training, aircrew moved to advanced training, where they specialized in heavy bombers. The B-17 transition training occurred at specialized bases, where pilots learned to fly the four-engine bomber. The B-17 was significantly more complex than the trainers student pilots had flown previously. It had 4 engines that required synchronization. It had complex electrical, hydraulic, and oxygen systems. It required crew coordination between pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and gunners. Learning to fly the aircraft competently required approximately 50 hours of flight time. Learning to fly it in tight formation required considerably more training. Combat crew training brought complete crews together for the first time. 10 men who had trained separately now had to function as a team. They practiced navigation, bombing runs, emergency procedures, and formation flying. They learned each other's voices on the intercom, understanding instantly who was reporting what based on voice and tone. They developed trust, the absolute confidence that each crew member would perform his duties competently under stress. After approximately 200 hours of training together, crews were declared combat ready and shipped to England. Upon arrival, they underwent additional training with their assigned bomb groups. This operational training introduced them to combat box formations, specific group procedures, English weather conditions, and the realities of European combat operations. Veterans shared lessons learned. Group commanders emphasized formation discipline. After several local training flights, new crews would fly their first combat mission, typically to a lightly defended target to build confidence. The mission day experience for combat box aircrews followed a pattern that became numbingly familiar. Wake-up call came at 0200 or 0300 hours for missions scheduled at dawn. Crews ate breakfast, often unable to eat much due to pre-mission anxiety. Briefing followed, where the group operations officer revealed the target using a map covered by a curtain. When the curtain pulled back to show a target deep in Germany, groans would fill the room. When it showed a target in occupied France, relief was palpable. The briefing covered expected fighter opposition, flak concentrations, weather conditions, formation assignments, radio frequencies, escape and evasion procedures if shot down, and time hacks to synchronize watches. Crews then collected their equipment: parachutes, Mae West life vests, escape kits, rations, oxygen masks, heated suits for the sub-zero temperatures at altitude. They were trucked to their aircraft on hard stands scattered around the airfield perimeter. The pre-flight inspection, crew station setup, and engine start consumed 30 to 40 minutes. Aircraft would taxi to the runway at precisely calculated intervals, take off at 1 minute spacing, and climb through whatever weather existed to the assembly altitude. Above the clouds, aircraft would form into their combat boxes using radio beacons, timing marks, and colored flares fired from lead aircraft. The assembly often took an hour or more as dozens of bombers sorted themselves into proper positions. Once assembled, the combat boxes would proceed toward the target at 160 Mafverstitisters indicated airspeed, climbing to bombing altitude of 25,000 to 27,000 feet. The entire formation moved as a single entity. Course changes were executed by the lead navigator. Altitude changes were coordinated. Aircraft maintained position through constant attention and control inputs. Oxygen was required above 10,000 feet. Temperatures at altitude reached -40 to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews wore electrically heated suits, but these sometimes malfunctioned, causing frostbite injuries. Fighter attacks began at the limit of escort range or over the target area. The intercom would crackle with calls. Fighters, 9 o'clock high. Fighters coming in 12 o'clock level. Gunners would traverse their weapons to engage. The bomber would shudder from the recoil of multiple guns firing simultaneously. Empty brass casings would cascade through the aircraft interior. The smell of cordite filled the cramped spaces. Attacking fighters would flash past at combined closing speeds exceeding 500 mm/feet. The bomb run required the formation to fly straight and level for several minutes, while the bombardier in the lead aircraft aligned his Norden bomb sight on the target. During this time, German anti-aircraft guns would track the formation and fire. The sky would fill with black puffs of exploding 80mm shells. Each puff represented shrapnel expanding at thousands of feet per second. Aircraft would shudder as shrapnel struck the fuselage and wings. The sound was distinctive, like gravel thrown against metal. When the lead bombardier released his bombs, every aircraft in the formation released simultaneously. Approximately 360,000 pounds of high explosive would fall toward the target. The aircraft, suddenly 5,000 pounds lighter, would lurch upward. Pilots would push forward on the yokes to maintain formation position. The formation would execute a turn away from the target, still, maintaining precise geometric spacing despite the flak and fighters. The return flight often proved more dangerous than the approach. Damaged aircraft struggled to maintain formation. Crews with wounded members dealt with medical emergencies while flying. Aircraft with engines shot out burned extra fuel from remaining engines, trying to maintain formation speed. Some would fall behind, becoming targets for German fighters that stalked the formations looking for stragglers. Crossing the English Channel meant relative safety. German fighters rarely pursued past the coast. Aircraft would begin descending to warmer altitudes. Crews would check injuries and damage. Radio operators would report wounded aboard and request ambulances and fire trucks at the landing field. Aircraft would peel off from formation and land individually. Some would crash land with damaged landing gear or insufficient control authority. Others would land normally, despite hundreds of holes in wings and fuselage. The debriefing lasted an hour or more. Intelligence officers interviewed each crew, plotting fighter attacks, identifying flak concentrations, assessing bomb damage, recording observations. Medical personnel treated the wounded. Chaplains comforted crews who had lost friends. The mission beer ration, 2 bottles per crew member, was distributed. Crews would return to barracks and sleep if they could, knowing they might fly again the next day. This cycle repeated day after day, week after week, until a crew completed 25 or later 30 missions, or until they were shot down. The psychological toll accumulated inexorably. The statistical improbability of survival was always present. Every mission brought them closer to completing their tour, or closer to becoming a casualty. The tension was unrelenting. The strategic results of the bombing campaign that the combat box formations enabled have been debated by historians for decades. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, concluded that strategic bombing had significantly degraded German industrial capacity and shortened the war, though perhaps by less than bombing advocates had claimed. Ball bearing production fell 50% after attacks on Schweinfurt. Aircraft production was disrupted, though never completely halted. Oil production declined catastrophically after sustained attacks on refineries and synthetic fuel plants. The human cost of defending against the bombers weakened German fighter forces to the point where they couldn't effectively defend against the eventual invasion of France. The diversion of German resources to air defense, fighters, anti-aircraft guns, radar systems, personnel, represented resources that couldn't be used on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces. The psychological impact on German civilian morale from sustained bombing was significant, though difficult to quantify. Whether these results justified the loss of 26,000 American aircrew killed remains a question, without simple answers. The aircrew who flew the missions believed their sacrifices mattered. They could see the destruction their bombs caused. They knew that German industrial output was declining. They understood that their operations drew German fighters away from other fronts. Whether historians' calculations of months saved or production percentages reduced adequately captures the campaign's value is debatable. What's indisputable is that the combat box formation made sustained daylight strategic bombing possible. Without the defensive effectiveness that geometric precision created, loss rates would have exceeded replacements, and the campaign would have been abandoned. The tight formations that required such extraordinary skill and discipline to maintain, that pushed pilots to their limits, that demanded constant attention for 8 or 10-hour missions, these formations enabled everything else. They were the foundation on which the strategic bombing campaign was built. The legacy of the combat box extended beyond World War II into the Cold War and influenced thinking about defensive systems generally. The principle that properly organized individual units create defensive capabilities exceeding their individual contributions informed military doctrine across services and eras. Naval task force organizations, armored warfare formations, air defense systems all reflect understanding that geometric positioning and mutual support create force multiplication. The specific tactic of tight bomber formations became obsolete with jet bombers and nuclear weapons. The B-47 and B-52 bombers of the 1950s flew individual missions rather than formation missions. Speed and altitude provided defense rather than massed defensive fire. Surface-to-air missiles made defensive guns irrelevant. The technological context changed completely, but the lesson remained that discipline, precision, and geometric relationships could transform vulnerable units into defensive systems that could survive in hostile environments. The young men who flew B-17s in combat boxes over Germany internalized this lesson through experience far more profound than any classroom instruction could provide. Those who survived carried that understanding into post-war careers in military aviation, aerospace industry, and strategic planning roles where they influenced American defense policy for decades. Major General Curtis LeMay's career exemplified this influence. His pioneering work developing combat box formations in 1943 led to command of the 3rd Air Division in 1944, where he implemented those formations across multiple bomb wings. His success led to assignment as commander of 60th East Bomber Command in the Pacific, where he directed the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. After the war, he commanded Strategic Air Command, building it into the primary nuclear deterrent force during the early Cold War. His understanding that discipline, precision, and systematic organization created combat effectiveness shaped SAC's culture for decades. The combat box formation stands as testament to American pragmatism in military operations. The formations weren't elegant. They were demanding, difficult, and dangerous. They required more training than most pilots received for other aircraft types. They demanded constant attention and created fatigue. They were inflexible, requiring the entire formation to maneuver as a unit rather than allowing individual initiative. They violated many principles of air combat tactics that emphasized speed, maneuverability, and flexibility. But they worked. They reduced bomber losses to levels where the strategic bombing campaign could continue. They made German fighter attacks costly enough that the Luftwaffe couldn't sustain the attrition. They enabled daylight precision bombing that destroyed German industrial targets. They proved that systematic organization and geometric precision could overcome individual performance advantages. And they demonstrated that sometimes the right solution is the one that works even when it contradicts conventional wisdom and proves extraordinarily demanding to implement. The Luftwaffe officers who mocked American formation flying as evidence of poor training and tactical rigidity learned through bitter experience that what they'd dismissed as a weakness was actually a strength. The tight geometric patterns that seemed inflexible created defensive fire density that German fighters couldn't overcome. The discipline that maintained formation integrity despite casualties and damage reflected training and determination that exceeded German estimates of American capabilities. The combat boxes they'd laughed at destroyed the Luftwaffe's fighter force through sustained attrition that Germany couldn't match. The story of how American bomber formations evolved from vulnerable targets to defensive fortresses is ultimately a story of adaptation, innovation, and determination. The young men who flew those formations faced terror daily. The losses were staggering. The physical and psychological demands were extreme. But they maintained formation integrity because they understood that survival depended on it. They held position when friends died in adjacent aircraft. They continued flying when reason said to turn back. They pressed toward targets when everything indicated the mission was suicidal. Their courage would have been wasted without the tactical innovation that transformed individual bombers into defensive systems. The combat box gave their courage practical effect. The geometric precision turned their determination into combat effectiveness. The formations that demanded so much from them also protected them, giving them fighting chance to survive and complete their missions. That combination of tactical innovation and human determination changed the course of the air war over Europe and demonstrated that sometimes the path to victory requires embracing solutions that seem impossibly demanding and trusting that human beings can meet those demands when survival depends on it. The mathematics were written in formation diagrams, firing tables, and geometric calculations. But the proof was written in the blood of German pilots who attacked what they thought were easy targets and discovered too late that American formation flying wasn't a weakness born of poor training, but a strength born of systematic analysis, relentless practice, and absolute discipline. The combat box formations made German fighters pay in blood for every bomber they destroyed, and ultimately that price became too high for Germany to afford.